Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Forest Fire and People webinar series. We see many people joining us this evening. If you want to go ahead and open that chat and let us know where you're watching from. We love to see guests from all over the state of Colorado as well as beyond. This series is brought to you by Colorado State University's Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Institute for Science and Policy. I am Kristen Uhlenbrock, your co-host and the director of the Institute, and I'm thrilled that you are joining us here this evening. Before we get started tonight, I do want to acknowledge with respect that I and our guests tonight reside on the traditional lands of 48 Native American tribes who now live throughout the American Southwest, Great Plains, and Rocky Mountains, including the Southern Ute, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche, the Shoshone, the Crow, and the Blackfeet tribes. We have guests tonight here in Colorado and in Montana. We honor them as the indigenous land stewards of these places and honor their ancestral and ongoing connections to it. We also want to acknowledge tonight that many people were impacted by the historic fires of 2020, including loss of lives and homes and landscapes, all while experiencing this public health crisis. Our hearts go out to anyone who was affected. If you joined us early, you heard Nicole mention that tonight is episode 4, our final episode in this 4-part series. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on the future of Western wildfires. We'll be discussing things such as how are we defining the problem that we're trying to manage, the possible solutions from science and policy to actions and attitudes, how do we live with fire, and what does this look like in the future? To say this is a complex problem is an understatement. But we hope that these 4-part episodes have brought you perhaps a little bit of a better understanding, a new perspective, a little nuance to this really complex challenge. I am thrilled that tonight we have another great set of guests. I also want to acknowledge and thank all of our previous guests and of course the Institute team and so many others for making this series possible. We do look for your questions here in the chat if you've joined us here on Zoom. So feel free to go ahead and drop in any questions you have as we go along through tonight's discussion. My partner and I will do our best to try to work in some of those into the conversation. We do love to see them. We don't get to all of them, but thank you for engaging with us here in the chat. So let me bring my partner and co-host into this conversation, John Sanderson, who is the director for the Center for Collaborative Conservation. And every time I do one of these, as well as all of the lead up to make this happen, it is such a pleasure to get to work with and talk with John. And so it's a little bittersweet that this is our last one. But John, good evening. How are you doing tonight?
Hey, Kristen, I'm doing great. Thank you so much. And I share the gratitude you expressed to your crew, our guests, the audience, and everyone who has been a part of this. So thank you all so much. And I'm looking forward to tonight's because, we're really going to focus this evening on tangible solutions to this challenge that we have around forest management and wildfires. We've heard from our past guests that it's not a question of if there will be a fire, but rather how we will choose to live with fire. And it's a fascinating topic, as you said, full of complexity and nuance. I think we'll also probably have a chance over the next hour to touch on some of the ways that all of you in our audience can engage as individuals and make a difference on this topic. And then before introducing this evening's guests, Kristen and I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Gates Family Foundation for their financial support of this series. And we'd also like to thank our partners at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute that one of our tonight's guests leads, the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, the Colorado State Forest Service, and also the Climate Adaptation Partnership. So there's a whole bunch of people who helped us prepare this series and have generated all kinds of really super helpful and useful information and guidance for us. So thank you all. We have 3 guests tonight. We have Ray Rasker, Tony Cheng, and Angela Boag. Ray is co-founder of Headwaters Economics, which is an independent nonprofit research group that works to improve community development and land management decisions. Ray grew up in Mexico City in a Dutch household, then came to the US as a student where he became an alum of Colorado State University, where I'm sitting, by earning a master's degree in agriculture and then he earned a PhD in economics from the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. Ray really enjoys working with people in rural communities who are passionate about place, and this has driven his engagement in rural development and the role of environmental quality in economic prosperity. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Super, we're glad to have you. Tony Cheng is a professor in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship, also at Colorado State University, and Tony is director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. Tony was born and raised in Eastern Washington. He earned a PhD in forestry from Oregon State University, and his primary research interests are in forest governance, policy, and administration, with a focus on collaborative approaches to resilience in forested landscapes. As director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, Tony oversees programs to develop, compile, and apply current knowledge to achieving shared goals around forest management and wildfire. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, John, and thanks for having me as part of this important conversation.
It's our pleasure. Thanks for being with us. And Angela Boag is a policy advisor on climate change, forest health, and energy in Colorado's Department of Natural Resources. Angela earned her master's degree in forestry from the University of British Columbia and a PhD from the University of Colorado, where she studied how changing climate and wildfire regimes impact forest resilience, as well as how private landowners adapt to changing conditions. In her current role, Angela works with a wide range of people and organizations to understand challenges and possible solutions. And she combines what she learns with her forest, wildfire, and climate expertise to advise the governor's office, legislators, and agency staff. Welcome, Angela.
Thanks so much, John. And I just want to say on behalf of DNR, thanks to all of you for hosting this conversation. It's certainly something we can't talk about enough, so thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and I'm glad you're able to be a part of it. So Angela, let's go ahead and start the dialogue with you. Past guests have said we need to expand our solution set. And so I'm wondering what you would say are perhaps the top 2 to 3 key points you would make related to both what is the problem and what are the solutions?
Yeah, great question. So, the way that I see the problem and, the leadership within the Department of Natural Resources really sees this problem is that we're experiencing an increasing risk of large wildfires and a greater area burned each year than we experienced in the 20th century, when much of Colorado and much of the West, was settled. And obviously there were lots of people in the West before we arrived. But, I think the 20th century is really the reference point that a lot of people use when we think about our current situation with wildfire in the West. And, it impacts communities. Unfortunately, it's been leading to loss of life and loss of entire communities in some areas of the West. And really, it's that threat of large wildfires, very aggressive wildfire behavior that we've witnessed in recent years, that's causing a real, sort of public health crisis, in terms of the wildfire smoke, but also a public safety emergency in many Western communities. And, this is happening for several reasons that everyone on this webinar has likely heard about, reading the news or listening to stories about wildfire issues in the West. And it's happening for a combination of reasons. One is we have had a history of suppressing fires over the 20th century and continuing now in many places. And that means that, we have dense forests, we have a lot of vegetation in areas that used to see more frequent fire. And so, if you think about a campfire itself, there's a lot of fuel that's out there to burn. And when you combine that with our warming climate, you have a lot of fuel that is very ready to burn. And then, the third piece of this, sort of three-legged stool of our fire problem is the people. So, we have people living in fire-prone areas. And not only does it mean that those communities are at risk and those lives are at risk, but it also means that we have more people, and not just those who live there, but folks recreating as well. We have more people in fire-prone landscapes who can start fires, and usually that's unintentionally. but that is a huge piece of our fire challenge as well. So it's a huge problem. I'm so glad that you've dedicated a whole series to really talking about it. But that's really the way I think that DNR sees it, and state government sees it. And I think for state decision makers, they are at the heart of it most concerned about public safety. At the very root of this issue. We obviously don't want to see people's lives impacted by wildfires, both in terms of directly being impacted, but also through smoke impacts and other impacts on both physical and mental health. And so, then when we think about solutions, we have to develop solutions that really match the scale of this massive problem. And scale, I think, is one thing that we'll talk a lot about today, I hope. I think that where state government in Colorado and many other Western states is moving is towards solutions that, that alter wildfire behavior in the right places at the right scale through the right work. And that work can look very different depending on where you are, depending on what type of forest you're in, or grassland for that matter, what type of community you're dealing with. There are a lot of tools in our toolbox, all the way from forest thinning in certain areas to using prescribed fire, to smarter land use codes and smarter building codes, and home retrofits to make homes safer. So there are a lot of tools in the toolbox, but I think our pathway to a solution lies with something that's on a much larger scale than some of the work that has gone on in recent decades, and is much more strategic and coordinated between all of the different players who are at the table. And again, I think we'll get into this, but there are a lot of players at the table because our forests, and other fire-prone landscapes cover vast areas of the US as well as other countries. So we are not alone in facing this challenge. So I'll stop there, but I hope that was enough to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, definitely. You covered a lot of ground there, Angela, and we'll dig into quite a bit of that. Tony, I know you've thought a lot about the question of scale and the tools that are in the toolbox. You've both researched it and worked with organizations across Colorado and the West to apply them. How would you say, are the key ways we should be thinking about the problems and the solutions?
Yeah, wildfire really is a paradox, right? From both a public policy perspective and a management approach. And so on the one, and a paradox is something that that inherently can exist simultaneously. So on the one hand, fire is an important part of our landscapes and our ecosystems. All of the forests and a lot of the ecosystems that we all enjoy and benefit from in Colorado and across the West and many parts of the world are dependent on fire. We need fire to produce those values, services, and goods for us. On the other, fire is obviously destructive force and impacts people very negatively. And so that makes for a very ill-defined policy problem. And we know that one of the hallmarks of good public policy is having a really clearly defined, tractable policy problem. But when you have kind of this paradox where on the one hand, in many places, we actually need more fire. In that same regard, those are places where maybe fire creates a risk and a hazard to the people and the values and the assets and the services that we rely upon. And so navigating that is really a troubling. And so policymakers and managers and communities are kind of left on their own devices about what's the best approach given that paradox. Do we reintroduce fire? Do we let fires burn? Do we suppress them? Especially in a forest landscapes where we have a variety of assets and resources and values that both rely on fire, but also are threatened by fire. The second thing I'll point out is that there are many jurisdictions. A lot of times we see on TV in terms of fire management, when the smoke is in the air, we see young men and women in yellow shirts and green pants, and the U.S. Force, the federal government. But there are actually many organizations and agencies that have roles and responsibilities and authorities over fire management and fire risk management. And because of the fuzziness and the geographic kind of variation about the paradox that I was just talking about, they come at it with their own interpretations. And so the best way out of this is through a collaborative approach, right? Is to get those jurisdictions and those actors together to define what is the fire problem for whom and where on the landscape, so that we can actually do that strategic identification of where on the landscape might there be opportunities to actually bring fire back, but where on the landscape are there areas where we might need to do more mitigative activities, and everybody has a role in taking part in those mitigative activities, from everything that Angela had spoken to, from the land use planning, building codes, home construction, defensible space, to more of the forest management tools that we often see applied, from mechanical thinning, manual thinning, prescribed burning, but also managing fire in ways other than just kind of aggressive full suppression. So many tools in the toolbox, but it really depends on where and who at the table, and it really relies on a much more collaborative, multi-scale approach than we've had up to this point.
Thank you, Tony. Ray, over to you with this broad question. And I want to make a connection too, to kind of set the foundation for you, that last week we had the mayor of Estes Park on in this dialogue, who was talking about her challenges managing the two big wildfires that were coming at Estes Park. And you are now engaging with Estes Park to plan for the future. And what does that tell you about the nature of the problem and the potential solutions we might want?
Well, yeah, thanks for that question. I think Angela and Tony did a really nice job of illustrating the complexity of this issue. This is truly a wicked problem. It's very complex. It's intellectually very interesting to work on because of its complexity, but it's really hard to get a grasp on what the simple solution is, right? And both of them also talked about scale, which is really important. We have a program to work with communities to help them with land use planning. So it's a program that communities apply to. They get accepted. We're with them for 1, 2, sometimes 3 years to help them pass land use regulations. So building codes, landscape ordinances, steep slope ordinances, that sort of thing. We've worked so far with 75 communities in 14 states. It's not easy, but from their perspective, the problem they're trying to solve is to keep their houses from going up in flames. And here's where I see a real opportunity, because the science of home ignition is pretty hopeful. It actually tells us this is a solvable problem. We've already solved this problem in an urban environment. After the big fires at the turn of the century in Chicago and San Francisco, we passed building codes. And we have fire departments who inspect our buildings and make sure we're up to code. And there's penalties if we're not up to code. So we've solved this in an urban setting. In more rural fire-prone lands, I think we can solve this problem as well. If you look at a fire, do a post-fire analysis, you'll see some houses burned to the ground and some houses right next door didn't burn. And there's a lot to learn from those houses that didn't burn. Again, the complexity of this, some people are working on watersheds, some people are working on fuel reduction programs. We're working specifically on helping people pass land use regulations to keep homes from going up in flames. And that's, it's difficult. If you look at the amount of money that this country has spent, for example, on suppression, $3.8 billion in the last few years. The amount of money that's being spent on mitigation is very, very small by comparison. And the amount of money spent helping communities with land use planning specifically, where you're basically saying, we're not saying don't build, but if you're going to build on a fire-prone landscape, it has to meet certain conditions of safety. And so, for example, requiring the use of flame retardant building materials. So that's where we are, trying to solve the home ignition problem. And basically assuming that fire by itself is not the problem. Houses going up in flames is the problem.
Thank you, Ray. I actually want Angela and Tony to chime in on this conversation. Let's stick on this a little bit about this. You know, you've very honed in, Ray, on the home ignition problem and protecting the home and having that as a really focused potential solution to some of these challenges that we've been dealing with. So both Angela and Tony, what are your thoughts on, you know, if we are really solving this home ignition problem, how much of the equation does that take out of some of the other concerns? And then what are other concerns that you think we should be focusing on when it comes to wildfires? Both of you can chime in. Angela, do you want to start? And Tony, you want to follow on?
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. It would certainly help a lot. You know, I think I was monitoring the chat a little bit, and somebody did raise this question about suppression. And you know, it's true that if we did not have lives and property at risk, there could be, I think, a much more open conversation about allowing fires to burn in cases where they can actually be quite beneficial. To Tony's point about managed wildland fire use, as we call it. I do, however, you know, want to emphasize my belief that not every home will be protected through home retrofits or through the use of you know, sort of fire resistant materials. It certainly helps a lot. And you know, if you own a home in the wildland urban interface, it's certainly a very smart idea to invest in those home retrofits. But I do want to just make the point that some of the fire behavior that we are seeing now, such as the fires that we witnessed this past fall in Colorado, that are wind-driven events, you know, fire burning extremely aggressively. Sometimes those fires, you know, it doesn't really matter what your home is constructed of, you know, and they move very quickly, and people have to evacuate sort of no matter what. So I just want to make that point. I do think that home hardening, as we call it, and you know, good land use planning is a critical piece of the conversation that is extremely underinvested in. And frankly, it's also politically very challenging to talk about local land use planning and you know, where we should be building and where we shouldn't, or what we should be doing if we're building in certain places. But I do just also want to make that point that I don't think it's a silver bullet necessarily. And we also have to be thinking about how fire behaves at landscape scales.
Yeah, to keep on the home loss theme here, the National Institutes for Standard and Technology have done a series of kind of post-fire forensics for a number of fires that burned kind of in the late 2000s into the mid 20-teens. From California, Texas, and it also includes the Waldo Canyon fire. And they were able to do a real deep dive using very kind of rigorous methodologies of, you know, so National Institutes for Standard and Technology is a federal government agency that sets standards for all kinds of stuff, like, you know, fire retardant materials for, you know, home construction and furniture and those kinds of things. So they do a lot of testing of different kinds of stuff, and so they have a whole team of fire protection engineers and those kinds of things. So they're really used to kind of deconstructing the mechanisms of what causes, you know, a home to burn, given all of these mediating tools that we have, right? Defensible space, Class C siding, flame-proof roofs, and those kinds of things. And they found that, and there's a number of folks in the chat that says even in the face of all of those interventions, homes still burn. And we also see that even in the face of people not taking those measures, those homes did not burn. So, right, what explains that? And one of the most important mediating variables that they found that made the difference between a home burning and not burning and most of all these fires is having firefighter resources. Firefighters were stationed at those places at the time that those homes were about to be engaged in embers or flames, and they raked embers away from the siding, they pulled wood stairs away from the front doors. Those things made the difference. And so, that's another equation, which is having sufficient firefighting resources at the right place at the right time. Last thing I'll say about that, though, is that in that Waldo Canyon fire report, they estimated that a home caught fire every minute for 6 hours. There is not enough firefighters in anywhere to be able to engage that many homes on fire during a wildland fire. And so I think this is the challenge, right? We talk kind of conceptually about living with fire, right? With, a lot of academics and a lot of people write about that. But what that means is that at some point, in many ways, it's almost like living in a hurricane or a tornado-prone landscape. At some point, there's a certain force of nature beyond which engineering solutions are not going to mitigate against. And I mean, that's a hard thing to swallow. I live in a floodplain. And we have all kinds of insurance and engineering and all that kind of stuff. But at some point, there is a force of nature that will occur that there's nothing that we can do except to be able to, evacuate our loved ones and maybe a few precious belongings.
I'd like to add to that, what we saw in California a few years ago, something that alarmed us all. We saw home-to-home ignition fires, and this is one of the challenges. There's a lot of modeling where we're trying to figure out where the most hazardous places are to try and direct building away from the most hazardous places. But all of those hazard models have not yet included the home as a fuel source. And this is where it's a game changer. Once you get home-to-home ignition, the home is a totally different fuel source. It burns very differently from the forest. And once you get these big urban conflagrations, those are almost hopeless. That said, the Institute of Business and Home Safety, Tony, it's another one of these research institutions. They have an interesting setup. They've got a giant warehouse. It's like an airplane hangar, and they build buildings in there, and then they subject them to all sorts of climatic problems, high winds and thunderstorms and that sort of thing. And they built homes, and last time they did this, they did it a really very interesting way. They built a home two ways. One was a typical home construction, and the other one was the latest technology in flame retardant construction. And then they showered embers at it. And then they filmed how it burned. And you could tell one side burned and one side didn't burn. We worked with them to try and document the price difference. So what if you had a home built the standard way, and then that same home, you build it again, but to the latest standards for flame resistant building technology. And the price difference was 2%. In other words, the wildfire resistant home was only 2% more expensive. So it's not an insurmountable problem to build homes this way. But you're right, there's no guarantee that with a severe enough fire that it isn't going to burn. There's always going to be something that'll ignite in the home. The good news for me, though, is that so many of the things that can be done to reduce the flammability of a home are actually fairly simple things to do that the homeowner can do. So that's the good news.
That's great. Boy, I think the three of you are already tremendously demonstrating the complexities of this challenge. There's one question that has come up in all of our past conversations over the past few weeks that we maybe haven't quite addressed directly. And that is, should we be building homes in these fire-prone places? Ray, you touched on it a little bit in your opening, and Tony, you mentioned floodplains, and which I think is a really interesting analog here, because we've come a long ways within our communities to say, actually, we just shouldn't build in those floodplains in the first place. But I'd be curious if each one of you could speak on that question about, should we be building in these forests? And well, I'll just leave it at that. Should we be building in these forests?
It depends who you ask. A land use decision is a local decision. The planning department can only go as far. A planning department can only go as far as its city commission or the county commission allows it to go. And if you look at the position that local governments are in, they benefit, at least in a perception way, they benefit from increased property taxes from new development. So there's a strong pressure to approve new developments. Of all the communities we've worked with, the 75 communities we've been in touch with and worked with, we've never run into one where they said we want to stop development on the most dangerous places. It's a nice academic exercise, but politically, we haven't seen it happen yet. There was a op-ed in the LA Times a couple of weeks ago where they said we should disallow development in dangerous places. But those opinions are rare. For the most part, at the local level, it's very tough politics to say that.
I'll also add that if you look at, Matt Caggiano with CFRI did some research on this recently. And if you look at those places that suffered the most home loss from wildland fires, a lot of them are in, areas that you wouldn't necessarily consider like, dense forest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. They are, chaparral. They are, kind of maybe pine woodlands. There were several fires in Texas that had a lot of home loss that were essentially grasslands intermixed with some eastern juniper. And then when you look at wildland-urban interface maps across the U.S., a high density of them are in, kind of forest and woodlands in the southeast that are very fire prone, right? From all kinds of ignition sources and those kinds of things. So, that's a normative question. That's a political question, and those kinds of things. And it depends on what you value, and still the risk, if we think about risk as the likelihood of a bad thing happening, we all, for those of us living in the Front Range of Colorado, get on I-25, assuming that the accident is not going to happen to us, right? The risk, the probability of us every time going is a very, very low percentage. And so we may spend our whole lives being able to drive up and down I-25 and nothing's going to happen to us. And so, that's another calculate, and yet we have all kinds of benefits by doing so. And so we make lots of calculations other than just the probability that a fire may occur and get into our communities.
But Tony, on your driving I-70 example, you do by law have to wear a seatbelt. And the cars are by law built in a way that can resist an impact. And you do have speed limits, and you do have a police force enforcing those limits. And that's what's lacking in the wildland-urban interface. The regulatory structure is lacking.
Angela, so you have a perspective from the state, and Ray's pointing out that regulations can be really useful, and Ray also mentioned a few minutes ago that that in Colorado and many Western states, these types of regulations happen very much on the local level. So thinking about it from the Department of Natural Resources perspective, how do you grapple with that need for regulation and careful planning and so forth, and the fact that those decisions are made at the local level? And you're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. It's a $1 billion question, John. So thank you. It's an incredibly challenging issue, and I should say that the state struggles with land use issues, not just on wildfire, but if you think about it, land use affects everything that the Department of Natural Resources manages. Whether it's water, wildlife. Part of my role is thinking about all the carbon that's stored in our grasslands and forests, and when we develop our natural areas, we can lose that carbon sink. And so land use is a huge challenge in everything that my agency does and many other state agencies and federal agencies do. And it means that, given that Colorado is a local control state, there's a lot of deference to local planning and local authority. It means that the state has to come up with sort of some really juicy carrots, some really juicy incentives to incentivize communities to plan in effective ways, to develop building codes that are effective. And I think there is a real opportunity for growth here. There's a lot of conversations around resilience, very broadly, to the whole suite of natural disasters that folks experience in Colorado, but not just natural disasters, social, health, and economic disasters, as well as we've experienced with COVID in this last year. How do you really give communities the support they need to be resilient? But getting back to the wildfire issue, one brief example that I'll provide to demonstrate that the state legislature is thinking about this too is that they're looking to revise one of the programs at the state level. It's called, and this is a mouthful, the Forest Restoration and Wildfire Risk Mitigation Grant Program. I know, it's a terrible name, but it's our Wildfire Risk Mitigation Grant Program through the State Forest Service. And I'll just put a quick plug in for it here, and we can share these resources with the audience afterwards. But it is a program that communities can apply to secure some funding, and it does require a match to do wildfire mitigation work in their communities. So that is a state resource that's out there. But in revising that program this year and giving it additional funding, the state legislature is looking to essentially score projects more highly in terms of giving them funding if they are in communities where the communities have taken it upon themselves to do some smart planning around wildfire risk mitigation. So that's just one example of the type of carrot that you can sort of weave into state policy to encourage communities to address this issue.
I want to build on when we talk about scale, John. We brought this up several times, that there's different ways of thinking about scale. A lot of times, when we talk about forests and fire and doing forest treatments to mitigate fire, we talk about like scale as a geographically sized thing. But what Andrew's talking about is that there's scales of action from individual to their communities, to counties, to the state, to the federal, right? Those are different types of scale. And we haven't gotten to scale with that kind of integrated approach. And so, I think what Angela's talking about is some policy design innovations here in Colorado. There's a lot of other states that are undergoing similar kind of policy designs to really try to integrate those scales of action so that they more align. So, this is a classic kind of collective action problem, almost like a social dilemma problem, that it's easy to free ride on other people's activities, right? Somebody mentioned now, like county sheriffs, and they are the first responders. And so it's like, well, I'm just going to free ride on my local emergency responders, and it absolves me from doing anything. Wildfire risk management is we have to overcome that free rider problem by starting to align those different scales of actions from the private individual all the way up to the federal government.
If I can pick up on something Angela is saying too, and have y'all start focusing a little bit on these levers of action, financial and otherwise. We have a couple comments in the chat about the role of insurance. Angela, you were talking about carrots and incentives, right? So what are some of these types of actions or levers that we have, particularly maybe from the insurance or financial side, that we can think about employing, or examples we've seen, you know what I mean, as you were just talking about, Tony, that can be potentially scaled or exported to other places? Where do we go with some of these other levers that we have, good and bad, carrots and sticks, depending on how you look at the world?
Well, I can chime in a little bit with regards to insurance. The Boulder Wildfire Partners program is an interesting one to look at. They partnered with insurance industry, and they do home-to-home inspections, very detailed home-to-home inspections. A homeowner gets a list of what they need to do. They get a certain amount of time to accomplish those tasks. And if they do, then they get a certification. They get a big sign that they can put on their driveway, but they also get reduced rates. And so that's one area where the insurance industry is helping out quite a bit, tying their rates and their eligibility to what a homeowner has done with regards to mitigation. So that program in Boulder is being replicated now in Missoula, Montana. So it's the first offshoot in another state to see if it works here. But by and large, people will not decide to build based on insurance. The way it works is you buy a piece of property, you get a loan, you get an architect, you get a builder, you build your property, and then you sit around the kitchen table and you go, oh, where are we going to get insurance? It's not forefront. It's not a yes/no decision. Like nobody has yet, in most places, there's a few exceptions, said, oh, we're not going to build because we can't find insurance. That hasn't happened yet. So we can't hold our breath and think that the insurance rates and insurance policies are going to change the pattern of development. But what insurance can do is they can provide some incentives for, once the development does occur, what the landowner can do on their property to mitigate their risk.
Yeah, I'll sort of, I don't want to speak too far. I think this is a really important discussion, and I think there's folks that, like, especially the Rocky Mountain Insurance Association, they think about this a lot. One thing that I have, in different, workshops and conferences that I have heard and understand, and if you think about how insurance works, especially home insurance, right? The risk pool draws from very large populations. So like in the Front Range of Colorado, for example, you have, 3 million odd insurance ratepayers. You might have a catastrophic wildfire event that takes out 300 to 500 homes, but that is easily absorbed by the 3 million insurance payers. The largest insurance payout, the largest single natural disaster insurance payout in Colorado history was a hailstorm that parked on top of Denver International Airport. That caused billions of dollars of damage to the airport, to airplanes, to all the parked cars, to the rental fleets. I mean, that home loss from wildfire, from an individual family perspective, is a catastrophic loss. You'll lose everything. From the insurance companies, it's a drop in the bucket compared to some of the natural hazard losses. So at least in places like Colorado, I think California, and Ray, you might know better, you get around a lot more than I do. That's changed. I think insurance companies in places like California, they're taking it in the short, so to speak, to that in terms of losses. But in places like Colorado, which is still very fire prone, and we experience losses, we're still not seeing that.
Yeah, I might jump in here and switch gears a little bit just to sort of zoom out and think about some of those other levers that we talk about. And, you know, I think Tony put it well that it's a collective action problem, and it's a problem that needs to be addressed at various sort of jurisdictional levels, you know, all at the same time. And so for folks on the call, you know, hopefully you're able to take something away from this, you know, in terms of things you can do for your own home if you're in a fire-prone area. But at the community scale, I just want to make the point that, you know, while it's not necessarily a carrot or a stick, being supportive of local funding solutions that can help a community really address sort of community level risk is a really, you know, great direction to go. Because, you know, if, for instance, your town or county can say, you know, pass just a small increase to property taxes or a sales tax, you know, especially if you can generate a lot of that sales tax off of tourists who are coming to visit, if you live in a sort of a more wild area, those funds can then be used to leverage state and federal funds to conduct some of these, you know, bigger treatments, whether it's prescribed fire or forest management projects, you know, in the vicinity of your community, whether it's on municipal lands or state-owned lands or federal lands in some cases. And so I think that's just another leverage point, you know, in the funding conversation, that, you know, the funding that's needed is massive, but it's not all going to come from the feds. It's not all going to come from the states. It has to come from local communities as well. And so that's just one, you know, small solution that can really tear up.
Angela, can I ask you to take that a little bit farther on the funding front? You mentioned federal funding and state funding and community level funding. And Ray started us out by mentioning the $3.7 billion spent on fire suppression, which every speaker we've had has talked about fire suppression as, yes, part of the solution and also part of the problem. But we invest this massive amount in fire suppression, a large, but I'm guessing Tony would argue not large enough amount on forest management. And then Ray shares with us we're way under investing on stuff we can do around homes. What are some of the other sources of money to manage these challenges? And of the sources that we've already mentioned, what is the state and others doing to change how those existing funds are spent?
Yeah, great questions. So the need is huge, you know, as you pointed out, and I think just for folks on the call, you know, to think about the scale of the challenge, you know, Ray pointed out that, you know, close to $4 billion has been spent on suppression in the last few years. And Ray, I'm sorry, I'm not sure of the geography that you're talking about, but we can get into that if it's west-wide or, okay, great, whole country. So that's helpful. And, you know, so to paint the picture of what's needed, if you're really thinking about mitigation in terms of just vegetation treatments, you know, to ideally reduce risk in some of our fire-prone areas. In Colorado alone, it's been estimated to be over $750 million, you know, and several billion dollars if you're talking about sort of restoring forests across Colorado to some of the historic structures that historically made them more resilient to fire. But if we just think about that 700 million number, that's sort of the ballpark that you have to start thinking about in terms of the combination of both local funding sources with state funding sources, and then also looking to our federal partners to work with the state and invest in those places, you know, that the state and local communities are prioritizing to mitigate wildfire risk. And, you know, I'll be the first to say that that combination of funds is nowhere close to what it needs to be to really address the size of the problem. But I will say that, you know, I think everyone agrees you should never let a catastrophe go to waste. I think the 2020 wildfires really focused people, and, you know, perhaps, you know, people might say it's a bit cynical that politicians only focus on these, or might cynically say politicians only focus on these issues, you know, when the emergency occurs, but, you know, it can lead to real change. So one example is that, you know, the forest restoration and risk mitigation program I talked about in our state forest service, historically, that's only been funded by the state at around $1 million per year, right? So that's a tiny drop in the bucket compared to the need. And just this session, they've introduced legislation, you know, to almost increase that 10 times, which would be funding that's ongoing in future years. And so again, that's still a drop in the bucket compared to the need, but thinking about increasing the order of magnitude of our investments is the right way, I think, to think about this. And once you've opened that door to that conversation around increasing order of magnitude at all levels of government, then I think you can start having conversations about the scale of investment that's really needed to address this challenge. And then I'll just say quickly on the suppression side, you know, unfortunately, while I think we've solved some of the challenges around funding, you know, for suppression, sort of stealing money from other aspects of our forest management, especially at the federal level, it's not going to go away. I think as long as people prioritize public safety, you know, I think any leader, you know, at the state level wants to protect people, and that is why you know, there has been additional focus on what we call initial attack in light of the 2020 wildfires, in terms of having the resources available to address wildfires when they start, and ideally keep them small. I think from my perspective, ideally keep them manageable so that, you know, perhaps they can burn and do some good on the landscape, but lives are also protected at the same time. So, you know, I don't think we have to have the mitigation or suppression conversation. I don't think we have to put those two things at odds as much as perhaps we have, but I do agree that the need for investment in mitigation is huge.
Let me shift this a little bit, if that's okay. We're coming up on the end of our time, and one of our guests here commented, this is a really good conversation, and talking about empowering people, right? And these solutions, where, you know, where are there in this collective active challenge that we have, what can people do from an individual scale up to their communities, to the state, to the federal level? There's a lot of different roles in all this, and we've been unpacking it, but we all have a role in this. So what are some things that people can do? I'm looking around. I'm going to start with Ray, but I'm encouraging all three of you, of course, to please chime in with your ideas.
Well, there's a lot of programs like the FireWise program that'll tell you what to do around your property, and they have a lot of great suggestions, right? But I think supporting your local elected officials and their efforts to use land use planning tools is probably something that's lacking, and they would appreciate it if you stepped up and said, yes, this community is ready for some type of a regulatory approach to deal with wildfire mitigation. Your local elected officials need your support, and speak up and help them out with that.
So I'll jump in. As far as the collective action, you know, kind of going from kind of your home and your community scale to maybe a larger scale. A lot of places here in Colorado and across many states have already different kind of coalitions dealing with some, you know, either watershed coalitions, watershed councils, or forest health collaborative groups, partnerships. You know, here along the Colorado Front Range, there's probably like 8 or 10 of them, just like even outside my window, that I can see that really operate in this landscape. And those are typically, you know, they're voluntary. A lot of them are convened and coordinated by, local community-based organizations that kind of take that from the next scale up. And a lot of them are really focused now on this kind of nexus between forests and fire and land and recreation, water. We didn't spend any time talking about water, but water, especially in the arid West, and the impact of forest fires on water supplies and watersheds. I mean, those are really big issues that there's a lot of activity that are organizing around. And that's just a great way to keep apprised, get information. And if you're so inclined, start attending meetings, getting on mailing lists, and just trying to find out what's happening in your own local backyard.
Yeah, and I'll just round us out here. I think one thing that everybody can do is to really stay curious about this issue. I'm so glad to see how many people are on the call today. But stay curious about it. Keep reading, keep learning, keep attending sessions like this, because really, I think this message about the fact that wildfire is a natural part of our ecosystems in the West. We're going to always have fire. Unfortunately, with climate change, we're likely going to continue having much more of it. And I think that is something that folks living in the West really need to internalize, and really internalize the fact that fire can be good, whether that is our natural fires burning as they should, or prescribed fire use, getting fire back on the ground in a more controlled way in the places where it can be beneficial. That's something that we should all take some time to think about, to learn from, and to talk to your neighbors about. Talk to your neighbors about the fact that not all fire is bad all the time, and that our ecosystems are adapted to it, and that's part of the solution here. It's just a small part of it. So that would be my first recommendation, and then the second is an age-old recommendation to reach out to your decision makers, whether they're folks at your in your county, in your town, who are making decisions about this, if it's your state legislators or your representatives at the federal level. Let them know that this is an important issue to you, that you think it requires investment, that you think it requires creative policymaking. They're dealing with a lot all the time, and many of them sort of have a fire hose of information coming at them, and it's really valuable if you reach out about a specific issue.
John, do you want to close this out? Any final questions you want to ask here? We've got a few more minutes.
Yeah, well, I'm in just a few minutes. Pretty much everything I want to ask is gonna potentially uncork something big, but here it is. Okay, so we have a modest snowpack in Colorado on a dry summer. A couple of folks have asked what to expect in going forward. You all three have thought a lot about climate. That's another big thing we have to mention that we haven't mentioned. Just one quick statement from each of you about how we prepare ourselves for change over time and for the things that we don't yet know.
Well, I'll say my little piece. In fire, people use a variety of triangles. There's kind of the fire triangle at different scales. The largest scale of the fire triangle is climate, ignition sources, and fuel. And so climate is changing. And we talked about fuels. You can even have grass as fuel or shrubs, and it still can carry a fire and destroy homes. We talked about that. One thing that we didn't talk about in the context of this series is just the sheer number of ignition sources that are out there on the land. And it's all of us. It's whether we live there, it's whether we recreate there. COVID in the Rocky Mountain region, we saw a COVID premium of recreation visitation that was between 30 and 40% more people recreating on a variety of lands. Probably most of the big fires that we experienced, at least here in Colorado, they were not natural causes. They were human caused in recreation areas. And so if there's one thing that we ought to really be paying attention to is just our own behavior. And you know, I mean, there's a lesson to be had in terms of Smokey Bear's lesson to you don't want to be the one to cause that fire.
Thank you, Tony. Ray.
Yeah, reducing ignitions. 97% of all fires that have involved homes were caused by people. So I think Tony's right. I mean, there's a simple thing we can do is just reduce ignitions. But quite frankly, what I would like to see is more money spent on mitigation. Very, very little money is being spent on mitigation. And I think that's where we need to go at all levels.
Define mitigation for us there, Ray. I'm sorry, just very quick.
Helping communities prepare. I mean, more and more people are going to keep building in fire-prone areas, and fires are going to continue to become more severe. Those two things are a fact of life. It's a question of how are we going to prepare ourselves for these fires? And that's mitigation. That's when you prepare for it with the latest available science, and some of it is quite hopeful. And you look at the resources communities are looking for to accomplish this, anywhere from a chipping program where they reduce fuel on people's homes, to helping with retrofits, to hiring consultants to help with land use planning. There's like almost no money for that. And given the scale of the problem, that is just tragic.
Angela, last word to you.
Sure. I'll steal from Tony. You know, he talked about the floodplain that he lives in, and I love that. You know, I think that going forward, anyone who lives in a fire-prone area, which is many areas of the West, and I encourage everyone to go to the Colorado State Forest Service, go to the Wildfire Risk Viewer if you live in Colorado, look at that map. You know, zoom in on the area where your house is and see sort of what it says, and don't take it, you know, as gospel, but use it to really inform yourself about the risk that you live with, and think about it as if you live in a floodplain, and what are the things that you may need to do to prepare yourself for potential risk. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Angela. Great pleasure having you on this evening. We covered a lot of ground, and I actually think this is really tangible takeaways that you all provided for our audience. And so thank you very much for your time and expertise this evening.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you too to our audience. Nicole dropped some links in there. Thanks to everyone on the team, all of our partners, the Gates Family Foundation for the financial support, who really helped put this series together. For those of you who still are with us, just as a quick reminder, we have a recording for all of these. We encourage you to pass them along to friends and neighbors, as Angela is mentioning, right? Continue this conversation. Share these resources that we've put together. It's 4 parts, they're about an hour each, but I think they're well worth it. We also have some additional reading material and resources for those of you who want to dig deeper. We definitely encourage that idea of staying curious so you can learn a little bit more and to make some really informed decisions about yourself, your lives, your home, your family, and your communities. And as Ray said, and Tony too, right, engaging with your local elected officials on this issue is probably very, very important. Everyone's a leader. Thank you. John, any closing words from you? It's been great to do this series with you.
Ray, Angela, Tony, thank you all so much. Kristen, it's been wonderful. And thanks to everyone who's still with us. Have a great night.
Thank you all. Stay safe. Take care.